It's time to put some respect back on Stifle's name.
Next on Eternal Dirtles.
Hey, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our Patreon supporters out there. Thank you to the Dirtle Maniacs. If you want to be a Dirtle Maniac, go to patreon.com/EternalDirtles and help support the channel. It keeps things going. It keeps things updated. Thanks so much for watching. On with the show.
Hello and welcome to Eternal Dirtles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Dude, I missed the memo that MH3 comes out, and then suddenly we're just on mass mana denial strats.
Just right back to Stifle Wasteland Daze. Yeah, it's a wild time.
Recursive Wasteland strategies. I mean, people, I guess, recognize that there was a weakness in mana bases and started to exploit them since the last time we talked.
Yeah, well, I think people have gotten a little lazy in their mana base building. Us included, right? Everyone's rocking those surveil lands instead of basics, right? That's a big part of it, right? So if everyone's mana base is super greedy, why not play a 2-color deck that can just attack people's mana bases and gain massive amounts of value off of things like Nulled Drifter and, of course, Phyrexian Dreadnought.
So here's a question for you. Is this just an example of people experimenting with MH3? Because one would argue that if you were going into a top tournament, that the top 2 decks, which are Grixis Delver and anything Beanstalk, that if you're Soul-type Beanstalk, you are less inclined to being blown out by Wasteland the way that the 5-color decks are. But also, if you're on your kind of Beanstalk, where you're playing Leyline of the Guild Pact, where you're fixing all of your colors and able to play some amount of basics, but the dynamic between Grixis Delver being so low to the ground that it can survive a Wasteland, because most of its shit is free or, extremely low to the ground, a la very common Delver variants that we've seen forever, that play, effectively on 2-mana tops, if they ever need that much. And then the Beanstalk decks are built to just draw so many resources that they can just play through a Wasteland or 2 over the course of a game. Now, of course, there's always going to be some amount of the non-games where it's just like, Wasteland never hit your second land, or, double Wasteland never hit your third land drop, like blowouts, whatever, okay? That's just part of the variance of the game. But in terms of, consistently mana denying an opponent, I would argue that the top 2 decks don't really care about mana denial if it's not your full-in, all-on strategy, a la, classic Life from the Lone Lands.
Yeah, well, I mean, so here's the thing: is these Stifle-not decks, right? They're also playing Harbinger of the Tides, which is a full-on mana denial package, right? Essentially. Yep. So that's a card that can do, basically it's Magus of the Moon, but you get to continue to play your cantrips. You still have access to Daze, if you need Daze. If your opponent gets back in the game and it's just like, oh, finally, I can finally cast a spell and try and get out of this. I'll cast a spell, and you're like, yeah, I'll just Daze that. That is the tempo decks are back. I think people, Delver has been on a bit of a downturn. Not like no one's playing Delver anymore, but we haven't talked about Delver for at least 20 episodes, right? Like Delver is no longer the boogeyman in the room.
Well, Delver has always just been Daze Wasteland plus Threat, and that has just been Rescaminator, right? So Rescaminator has just sort of assumed the mantle of what the Delver deck is. It just doesn't happen to have actual factual Delvers in it. But, I mean, I do expect us to see a resurgence of Grixis Delver, because I think Psychic Frog will be that sort of chunky house that plays through the graveyard in ways that DRC has trouble doing and Murktide region has trouble doing, but also because in ways that the other cards can't necessarily hold down the board, a Psychic Frog can hold down the board very similarly to what a Baleful Strix used to do, where Baleful Strix sits on the table and it sort of just gunks up the board until there's some sort of breakthrough, or somebody's willing to go down a card in exchange for damage or pressure or what have you. And Psychic Frog sort of gets to do that in that it's really hard to attack into one, or it's really hard to block one. And so the combination of Psychic Frog entering the mix, I would also expect us to see when Grixis Delver reemerges. And this, I assume, will also happen once the inevitable grief ban comes. Anybody who wants to see the discussion on whether or not grief should be banned, go check out the previous episode.
It's actually our best video ever. Yeah. So right now it's trending as our #1 video, which is pretty wild.
People love salt in the summer. Okay, they just want a little bit of extra flavor. So
this episode is brought to you by Tales of Adventure. Go to toamagic.com and use the code DIRTLES for 5% off your order. you'll be directly supporting the show. And you'll get the entire order in one package. No more waiting for several packages. That's toamagic.com, code DURTLES for 5% off.
Yeah, I expect there to be a resurgence of Grixis Delver, and I expect that Molten Collapse is going to be a card that we're going to see like move up to like 2 copies, 3 copies, things like that. Because now, and also you'll see plenty of Pyroblasts like back in the mix because you need both hard answers to Murktide and Psychic Frog, and Lightning Bolts are just not going to get that part done. Now, I'm not sure at what point, if ever, there's a point where Bolt is going to be weak enough, given the current climate, where like that reach isn't necessary, but having a lot of big chunkers between DRC, Psychic Frog, Murktide Regent, you may not necessarily need that kind of reach because every creature theoretically can close in one shot, and so there's some potential there. So I expect there to be a little bit more towards that like Doomblade sort of removal, like just hard removal for like the chunkier threats rather than the damage-based removal threats. But we'll see when we get there. I do expect once MH3 sort of peters down a little bit that we're going to see Rescaminator and Beanstalk go back to the top of the tables. And I expect Sultai Beanstalk or Sultai Beanstalk with a light splash to be the go-to best Beanstalk deck, aside from a good event for your style of Beanstalk, where it's really just
gotta play them ley lines.
Gotta play the ley lines. But I think that part of it is, if you're playing Leyline Beanstalk, you're just going to be insulated against getting color screwed. But if you're the Soul-type Beanstalk deck, you get to be a mana denial strat on top of a control strategy. And then, obviously, Rescaminator is similarly picking apart your opponent and mind-twisting them turn 1, and then also having some access to mana denial. So I think the combination of that, of forcing the game to just be really compact and low to the ground, between Beanstalk having nothing but free spells plus Beanstalks, and then between the Scaminator doing exactly what it does, which is just 12 free counter spells or disruption pieces, and then nothing but chunky threats that close on their own, or just being incidentally a reanimator combo deck. So I expect those 2 decks to really hamper everybody back down to reality by midsummer. Like by the time we meet up in Baltimore for the 5K, I expect that we will have been settled back to. Although I'm not sure, is the August ban announcement before Baltimore?
No, I believe Baltimore. Let's find out real fast. Baltimore, I think, is in July. SCG Con Baltimore, right? We're going to find out in real time. SCG Con Baltimore is July 26th this year.
So the August ban announcement obviously will be after. Okay. So Baltimore.
Eternal Dirtles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy, and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned.
Which is a 5K in SCG Con. That'll be a grief event, so we'll see a bunch of grief at that one. But do you think
the first big event, Phil, after the ban announcement will probably be Vegas? Well, it will be like the tournaments in Vegas, the Winna Art Piece and the Legacy Cup.
Yes, very excited for the Legacy Cup to return, which we'll actually get to be there for this time around, which is going to be sweet.
Yeah. Just book the tickets today, yeah.
Hell yeah. But talk to me. We're seeing this Stifle-Knot, people sort of brewing around, and I'm less surprised by people brewing with new toys like, dressed down into No Drifter with Stifle and Dreadnought, like
so good.
Similar space, right? Just another chunky threat that works with dress down, right? Because you draw 2 cards and then you get a 4/4 flying Annihilator 1 creature. So like your density of things that pair with the dress down is higher. So obviously, like, it just makes sense deck building wise. But in terms of how we are supposed to respect that potential kind of shift of these chunky threats that work with disruption pieces, I'm more so interested in what the foundation of those decks are, which is the mana denial strategy between Wasteland and Stifle. And then Wasteland, Stifle, Daze. Like, Daze and Wasteland are obviously the package that always come together. And then Stifle, in addition to that, goes back to like your old Rug Thresh days. But that's really where the foundation of the deck building is in terms of like how we combat it. Because if they do the mana denial strat, which is what they're primarily doing, if they accomplish that, they can beat you with anything, right? The threats on the after the fact.
You can beat them with a ham sandwich if you have to,
It's like if your opponent goes Chalice Trinisphere, and then it doesn't matter what they do afterwards, right? Like, you're dead. So if they do the mana denial strat.
I'll say this, Phil. In a world where your opponent puts you down like a land, through Stifle and Wasteland, and then follows it up, like let's say turn 3 or 4, they're like, okay, dress down, and I have 1 land in play, and I'm like, oh no, untap, Null Drifter, and I'm like, the game's over. Like if I have one or two lands in play and my opponent plays a Null Drifter, there is no coming back from that. There's no way I can get rid of the Null Drifter unless I have, specifically my deck where I have like Leyline Binding to get rid of it, right? If you don't have a way to get rid of the Null Drifter, the game is essentially over. Getting hit for 4 means nothing. Getting Annihilator 1 every turn is it's in the perfect spot in this deck, right? Like this is exactly where you want an Annihilator 1 trigger to happen. When your opponent's down on mana, you've kind of mana screwed them, and you're just like, boop. Now you can never play a second land.
Yeah, the Null Drifter, the Annihilator 1 on the Null Drifter in combination with that mana denial strat is really the top end of the mana denial strat, because Annihilator 1 often just reads Stone Rain, right? Attacks, destroy target land, or target opponent sacrifices a land. So it really it complements that package really, really tightly. But again, it goes back to, okay, if we're in that mana denial strat, then people who are trying to combat that strategy, it's really hard to combat that strategy if you don't have specific tools, but it's tough to line up those specific tools. So for instance, for example, if you're expecting to go up against a lot of Stifle, a card that you would have often in your board to combat that sort of metagame would be some number of Flusterstorms, right? So you actually can compete on the same level of catching whatever they're doing. But it's tricky in a world where if it's Wasteland plus Stifle plus an additional kind of mana denial a la Null Drifter, it's really hard to find an answer because those are three separate things that don't have equivalent easy access, universal answers for. So what that lends me to think is that the actual correct way to navigate around those kinds of strategies has been what it's always been, which is, okay, if these things are warping, right, if Daze Wasteland is warping, and then you're complementing Daze Wasteland with additional denial, then the way that you have to combat that is by compressing. So you have to compress your curve down, so that way the Wasteland or whatever isn't blocking you out of your 3-drops, your 4-drops. Sometimes your 2-drops if you're too clunked on them.
And this is why I'm playing the Leyline of the Guild Pact version, because I can take my, no one's paying 14 mana for a Scion of Draco, but I'm taking a threat that is normally not a 2-mana threat, right? Like 2 mana for a flying 4/4 lifelink vigilant, first strike trampler. That's where you want to be, with hexproof, right? So in that scenario, I can get under those decks, or I can play Leyline Binding to get under to answer those threats. But still, like, the thing about Null Drifter too is it feels terrible when your opponent, even if you can answer it, right? Your opponent still did draw 2 cards, right? Like, it's not nothing, they played Divination, haha, you got them, but you had to spend a card to get that thing off the board. So it's you're not in an ideal situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, like Divination with upside, right? I mean, we're in a world where we're in a world where people are casting, Lorien Revealed for 5, me included, as a legitimate strat. So the sorcerer speed raw card advantage spells are not laughable to me, particularly because when that card draw is just tacked on, it's not the things, like it's not the main purpose that it's there. It just happens to be a free roll, like a 4/4 Annihilator 1 that draws 2 cards on cast. That's an obviously playable card, right? Of course, you need to pair it with something else, but the failsafe is that it's a divination that can't get force negations,
Yeah. There's not a whole lot more to say about this particular deck. Like, I mean, Psychic Frog, Foe Masters, Null Drifter. The only thing this deck isn't running is Grief, right? And then you've got Dress Down, which makes it also resilient against decks that want to play, Nadu and into Thassa's Oracle or Doomsday into Thassa's Oracle. So you've got a little bit of resilience there against those sort of decks as well. And then your classic, Brainstorm, Daze, Force of Will, all that nonsense. It is a clean list. And then what's funny is that a deck like this, that is literally targeting people's bad basic plan, right? Like, you're not playing any basics, I got you. It's only playing 2 basics, and it is basically a monocolored deck that also has like a black mana for Psychic Frog, right? Like, this is a mono blue deck that has Psychic Frog in it.
Yeah, it's a mono blue deck with a bunch of like weird variant, like between No Drifter and actual Dreadnought, and like all that stuff that like to like base around it. But yeah. it is more or less mono blue with a splash. But even still, being at that point, it's also only running it's not running very many basics because it just doesn't need to because it's so low to the ground.
Yeah.
Like the curve actually stops at 3, and that's just the evoke.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's talk about what the current meta looks like actually, Phil, because it's been a while since we did a quick look at what the meta is, and I think it would behoove us as we move into the summer to just kind of have an idea of what we're looking at, right? So obviously Scaminator is number 1, followed by Delver, followed by Mono Red Prison, Beanstalk Control, Selesnya Depths, so Demir Scam again. That's weird.
So for Beanstalk Control, just clarify when you say Beanstalk Control, what kind of Beanstalk Control? Beanstalk Control with or without Wasteland?
So this is without Wasteland. This version is actually this particular version that they're showing here was a 5-3. It was 8th place in the Legacy qualifier on the 2nd, which was a minute ago. I will say. And that one, let's get a better look. Let's get one that's a little more recent than that because that's not doing it for me.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the 18th. Yeah, here we go. So this one's similar, and this is actually playing Urion and Uro and Null Drifter all together, which is wild because you're not going to get the bump off of Null Drifter on this. Like it doesn't, you're not casting it, right?
No, I think the baseline there is that Uro and Null Drifter are both chunky things to put in after a dress down's in play. So it's following more into that
would
space.
make sense, yeah.
Yeah. I also think that there's interesting space for the Uro piles, and it might be that the top end of the format being so compressed just makes it too clunky. But there is the world of people experimenting with Talon Gates, the new land
yes.
that phases out.
I've seen it.
Yeah, you Uro, put the Talon Gates in, phase out the Uro, and so you don't have to escape it, and it's protected until your next turn. So it draws the card, puts in the land, phases it out, and then untaps, and then,
that is spicy. I like that.
Yeah. You haven't seen that yet?
I've not. No one's done that to me. I did play one deck that was. I want to say it was the Cradle Control deck, and there was a couple times where they saved their own guy with by fetching a Talon Gates in response to me trying to kill an Elvish Reclaimer or something like that.
Yeah.
But in that scenario, I'm playing a main deck Wrath of the Skies and 2 in the board, so I was able to take that game down relatively easily.
Yeah, I think Talon Gates is a card that's likely to be explored a little bit more. I would be
a contender for sure.
Yeah. It's just being no, don't get me wrong. 4 mana is a lot, but you can 4 mana instant speed it into play to remove a creature from the board in any position, and having an uncounterable removal spell in that way is very similar to Otawara. Depending on what you're looking to do. So if you're in a space of okay, you can. If you're playing Otawara as it's an additional blue source instead of your island or whatever, and you're looking to actually bounce, things that you would otherwise have problems with. But if you're in a space where you actually do care about the phasing on both your side and their side, like you were talking about in an Elvish Reclaimer or a Knight of the Reliquary deck, or in any crop rotation deck that would care about protecting its Marrow Blades or whatever, I know Shijiri Step is usually in that space because it goes for the kill, but you might be in positions where the Shijiri Step coming into play tapped is not ideal. The fact that the Talons can also actually fix colors, it is one tap to make another color, but it does filter, which is not nothing in a space where if white mana is otherwise meaningless to you. So I think that there's still a little room to play with that card. I think there might be some space for the Uro decks to explore in that space, and for the Knight of the Reliquary decks to explore in that space. But again, those are 3 drops, and we're in a world where it's really hard to be doing that.
Yeah. Funny thing that I have not seen on this list at all is, still 8-cast not on this list at all. Not listed as a Stompy deck or anything like that. So in the top 15 decks in Legacy right now, no one's paying attention to 8-cast. So this might be the time, 8-cast gamers to jump in and slam in with a couple Urza Sagas.
Yo, my man, talking about 8-cast coming back after he was just talking about playing a bunch of Wrath of the Skies.
I'm respecting it, but not everyone is. They did just reprint Meltdown, so there's a lot more Meltdowns out there in the universe right now. So that something to keep in mind. But I think I think with so many people focused on Riskaminator, especially with the ban announcement, right? Not as many people are aware of how good that 8-cast, especially with those Emeries being that redundancy plan that we were talking about, right? How good that deck is against against Riskaminator if you can play a couple of main deck hate cards and have the backup of Emery to bring them back into play.
Yeah, I wonder, like, between like Urza Saga is probably the area where there's most room for something to emerge as like a contender against the Beanstalk. I mean, it really, in my mind, I think like you have your Days Wasteland shell, which is just happens to be Scaminator is the best version of that right now, and then you have Beanstalk, which is just the overwhelming individual piece that's like super dominant over every other deck that would like to play any amount of a long game. And then Urza Saga is the third pillar to me.
Yeah.
And then of course you have like the outliers of like Dark Ritual and Stompy, but I think of those as outliers as opposed rather than like actual dominant main deck contender sort of things. Like, yes, you have to respect them or you'll lose to them, but it's not what I imagine like the majority of players will show up with. Like, I think there's like you have your subsection of Stompy players and your subsection of Dark Ritual players. But then like when you go into an event, you're just more likely going to be running into Days Wasteland strategies to some capacity. And then anybody who's not doing Wasteland Days, who's not trying to Chalice, who's not trying to Dark Ritual, who's not trying to Days Wasteland, is playing Beanstalk. So I would gear more towards for those cards. But yeah, I think that Urza Saga has still the most room to explore, particularly because Swiftfoot Boots came out and then was sort of like this thing that like could totally turn the map around to like kill people out of nowhere, and then Rescaminator just like sort of took all the brunt of the headlines, and then MH3 came out, and so this Thunder Junction card that like makes it so that an Urza Saga can kill the turn that it cracks is just not seeing the same amount of play that I imagined it would have. And I don't know if that's also because people are playing some number of Wrath of the Skies and checking the decks that would play Urza Saga a little bit more. It might also be that
hitting an Urza Saga with the Wrath of Skies, nothing feels better. Nothing feels better.
Yeah, especially if you're on the play and you can just Wrath of the Skies to wasteland them.
Yeah,
that feels really, really good. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's also the energy package. I haven't seen anybody actually experiment with that in a legitimate way yet. Between Galvanic Discharge, Tune the Narrative, and Wrath of the Skies as just a way of like conditional board control, and then you play the other cards that you would naturally use to do the stack in a la Jeskai Control, right? Like there was Jeskai Control a long time ago of like mono 3-drop walkers, and they would play some number of Terminus or some number of Supreme Verdict, and I feel like Wrath of the Skies is just going to be better in those builds because your walkers survive through them, and it's just cheaper. Yeah. And it's much more lower to the ground. Like you're much closer to hit a Tugu that consumes all. But between Discharge and Tune the Narrative, you could 2-mana Wrath of the Skies for 4 or 5 and clear a whole board.
Well, also, Phil, something to think about too. Going back to the Urza Saga interaction, right? Is let's say I'm on the draw, right? You play your Urza Saga first. I play a land, right? You play your your Ancient Tomb or whatever. We go to my turn. I play a land. If I cast Wrath the Skies, right, for 0, sure, you go ahead and fetch and make a construct. The construct still dies too. It's a weird amount of like tempo that you gain with Wrath of Skies against specifically Urza Saga, because normally it's like, oh, I'll wasteland your Urza Saga, like I'll make a guy, So being able to hit all the stuff that the what's called makes. That the Urza Saga makes is just brutal, especially if they're like they're like on their second Urza Saga, and you're just like, okay, well, Urza Saga for I'll Wrath the Skies for 0, hitting the artifact that you grabbed, hitting both of the both of the constructs that you already have. Oh, did you want to make a construct? Too bad, it doesn't matter. Being able to like get sort of an up tempo play in a control deck is something that's pretty huge. And it's not often mentioned because we don't normally have a card that kills the thing that makes the token and the token, right?
Yeah, and I think Wrath of the Skies is probably one of the cards that's underexplored still thus far, only because nobody has really tried to make. You kind of need that energy package if you want to make it a deck as opposed to just a sideboard card the way that you and I have been playing it. So there's still probably some amount of room for exploration there. Now, I don't know how good that is in terms of like how good board control can actually be. In that, if you're playing against, Beanstalk, okay, well, they've already recouped the card, so unless you're clearing multiple things in addition to the Beanstalk and they've cantrips, you're not really getting all that far ahead. There's a lot of the top decks are individual threats, or like we were just talking about, it's like people experimenting with Nulled Drifter, which is really hard to Wrath of the Skies. So it might be that there's like the way that people are playing right now, like there hasn't been a need to explore Wrath of the Skies. But the more we like you and I talk off the pod about Wrath of the Skies, the more and more I think about like nobody has tried to Teferi instant speed a Wrath of the Skies yet, and being able to do that with an energy, with some amount of energy in reserve, to just be like, all right, 2 mana Wrath your board on tap, like Teferi is still a brick house that has fallen by the wayside because the Daze Wasteland decks are just so overpowering, and bouncing any individual thing is not as powerful because usually you're trading down on mana, and tempo in the decks that want to play Teferi is not as useful unless you're exactly specifically breakfast, in which case you're really just playing it more so for the static ability. But
yeah, you're just playing it as an Orms chant.
Yeah, I do think that the energy is there's still some room to be played with energy. There's still some room to be played with Talon Gates. I mean, obviously, people have already like found Nulled Drifter out of MH3 and pairing it alongside Stifle-Knot, and I think that really has highlighted for me. And tell me if this has been your experience. If you've been playing a lot more on Moto too, watch Zach's stream whenever he's on.
Links below.
Yeah, it might be that the incentive of all of this is, okay, if we're all going to be low to the ground, that the way that we have to fight being low to the ground is just denying the mana all the way down to like, okay, if you're playing a bunch of 2-drops between Bowmaster and Psychic Frog and Dothy Voidwalker, it's like, and Animate Dead or whatever, it's like, okay, then we just have to fight before we get to 2 mana. A lot of matchups will just
Spell Snare's back. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying that like literally like in order to fight, we're going to go back to like hard mana denial plus these chunky individual threats because between Murktide being effectively a 2-drop and Psychic Frog being this really chunky 2-drop and Dothy Voidwalker being this hate bear that like is unblockable and evasive and Bowmaster being a pseudo lock piece that like can kill very fast at instant speed while holding up any amount of interaction first. But all of these things are individually powerful, and all of them just care about hitting your second land drop. And if we need to fight to ensure that like the format is so compressed that our dazes are just always live, that we further compress that by playing Stifle in addition, okay, like yes, there's going to be some decks that recognize that and then move into a space of like, okay, Dreadnought No Drifter with Dress Down or whatever. But if the in the aggregate, if the format is in a place where, okay, the best things have been found, and now the best thing to do against the best things are who can deny each other's mana harder. And so it's like, if you and I are playing the same thing, but you're playing removal spells and I'm playing mana denial, like I'm playing Stifle while you're playing Fatal Pushes, like, well, if we can get into a space where I can deny you ever being able to convert those removal spells, right, because the mana has to come first, that, okay, I'm just a level up and you're going to have a really hard time because if I can control your mana, then I control the narrative, and then you're going to have to walk into positions where you're going to walk into my dazes, into my counter spells, because you're going to be playing on the back foot. So, maybe we've reached that level. Like maybe we've gotten to the point where the top decks are just known, and now when people experiment, they're sort of stumbling into whatever the next level up is, which is just, okay, at a foundational level, if we found the actual best thing, then what is the best thing based off of? Well, it's not letting your opponent get to 2 mana, because Daze just trades with their 2 mana, and that's critical in a format where every single threat is theoretically game ending on a single swing.
Yeah. Another thing to kind of keep in mind too is, when we're talking about mana denial and whatnot, and just two thoughts here. One is if you are going on that like energy plan, right? You can't read Tune Narrative as like 1 mana, draw a card, 2 energy, right? You got to read that card as 1 mana, gain 2 mana for later use, draw a card, right? Like that's how you have to kind of think about of that card. And then my other point is, it might be time to start thinking about how you play, and if you can play around Daze, if you can play around Stifle like that. I mean, that's what this episode is, right? Like respect Stifle, right? Respect Daze. So if you can start playing around those cards, that was my biggest concern as a Rug Delver player. As a Rug Delver player, I'm a much better control player now, because I just go, let's just pretend they have it all the time. and then they have a handful of useless cards against you, because eventually they have to start making plays to end the game before you get into your you get out of the development stage of the game, right? Like if as a control player, if you get out of the development stage of the game is generally over for the for tempo decks. You know, yeah, they can play a Murktide Region, or they can play a Phyrexian Dreadnought and get you, but you have so much more agency if you can get out of that development stage of the game and make it to turn 5, 6, 7, right? So if you can just outlast your opponent in this, like, you know, we're just gonna do the high noon stare at each other for like 5 or 6 turns, you're in a better place because you've seen more cards, and they're gonna get to a point where they're not drawing lands, right? And they have to start discarding stuff. And if they're doing that but staying open, they're gonna have to blink first, because they know that if they don't blink first, they're gonna lose. They're gonna lose on the high ground of the game. They're gonna lose the mana advantage that they have, because eventually you're just gonna get more lands than they are. Through the nature of just as a control deck, you have more lands than your average Delver deck does.
I would challenge that, because I think that, like, in terms of more lands, like what, maybe you're running 20 or 21 instead of 18?
20, yeah.
20, which is not a significant chunk more. Like, maybe you draw an additional one in your first 3 draw steps, but outside of that, like, I would challenge that the idea of playing around Stifle and Daze is a luxury, assuming that they haven't deployed a threat.
Of course.
But the difference of our olden days of Rogue Thresh is, like, when they deployed a threat, it was a 1/1 for a long time.
It was a 1/1 that just sat there for a while.
Right?
Yeah.
So there was time while you were taking chunks to the face. Where now, if they deploy a threat, like, the games end a lot faster.
Yeah,
and
your life is a resource, but it's certainly much less of a resource than it used to be.
If you're also, like, let's say that you are in a position of starting the game and you're like, okay, I think my opponent's on a Stifle list, and, like, even if they just go land pass, and you're like, okay, I have to respect Stifle here, so I'm not going to make my turn 1 play, I'm just going to play my fetch and pass. They already control the narrative, right? Like, they get to choose when that, like you have effectively been wastelanded until they decide to move. Like, you both are porting each other, right? But they have control of when that stalemate ends, unless they don't deploy a threat and you get multiple turns to actually get through it. So if at any point, like, they control the narrative, and then if they control the threat, then you are forced to act. So
yes, and then that's when you have to play in Daze, of course.
Which, again, and that's that idea of, like, they already control the narrative, and then if you try to play, like, it's like, yes, if I can play around things, that's a luxury, but that's not a luxury that's always given to me because I don't control the narrative. They will control the narrative, and then if they deploy a threat, I'll be forced to act because the game actually has a clock now. And so the only real legitimate way to combat all that is, again, to, like, okay, well, you're saying get to, you know, turn 5, 6, 7, whatever, to, like, hit more land drops. Essentially, the way that you get to play around that stuff that is warping sooner is to just compress your curve down, right? So, like, the way that you play around Daze is like, okay, well, if my curve also stops at 2, then when I hit my 3rd land drop, I can finally I can actually act while playing around all the stuff that you're trying to play around. Whereas, like, that doesn't happen if you're playing with anything above that on the curve. So when, you know, the mana denial strat of Daze Wasteland, I get we're going back to a little, you know, fundamentals 101 here, but Daze Wasteland already obfuscates the idea of playing 3 drops at all. And if you are, you're just making those cards obviously infinitely more powerful, because in order to get to the additional land drop means that you need additional more draw steps. And in a world where, like, the threats are just so overwhelmingly stronger and hit a lot harder and the game's end faster, you just don't have that time. So, you know, I would argue that, like, yes, you, if you're playing around Daze Wasteland, that is a luxury that you can only give yourself if you've actually done the, like, bit the bullet and compressed your curve down to be prepared to put yourself in a position to do that in the first place. You know, you can't sit down at a table with your Knight of the Reliquaries and think, oh yeah, I'm just going to be able to wait out this Stifle and this Daze and this Wasteland. You know, like, that's just not a world you're going to get to unless you're playing, like, a whole ton of basics and you naturally draw them and don't play fetch lands. You know, so. You know, funny
that we're in a position where you, as the known control player, are advocating for the power level of tempo, and I'm advocating for the power of control decks.
Well, I'm advocating for the power of tempo, not because I think that, like, tempo is the best thing, but because it's like, okay, well, all of the best threats are the best threats in every deck you play, right?
For sure,
They're
yeah.
all the same threats. Like Psychic Frog just happens to now slot into one of the best threats, but it's all the same stuff. If you look at Beanstalk, if you look at Delver, if you're looking at Grief, the Restaninator, it's all the same threats. So if all the threats are uniform across the thing, then it's just whoever's lower to the ground, right? Because if I can deploy the more powerful thing faster than you with protection faster than you, then I just win, because otherwise all things are equal. So if all things are equal but I'm lower, okay, well then you can't overpower me with your threats because mine are just better, or mine are just equivalent but lower to the ground. It's like why Sultai Beanstalk always was able to beat up on 5-color Beanstalk. Well, the threats and everything are equivalent. The only difference is I'm low to the ground and can mess with you, right? If I'm Sultai and you're 5-color. Yeah. So unless 5-color then, compresses itself a la Leyline Guild Pact, right? Like Leyline Guild Pact Beanstalk, everything stops at 2. Right, I put in this thing. My mana is clean, and then I it's not clean, but the problem is solved. Right, I never get color screwed because I have Leyline on the table, and then everything is 2 mana and no more. So that is in my mind. Leyline Guild Pact Beanstalk was just the 5-color Beanstalk's adaptation to getting beat up by Sultai Beanstalk, which was just the middle ground between your Daze Wasteland Delver shells and Beanstalk. Right? Yeah. But when all those things converge, it's all the same threats, and nothing actually matters except who can actually deploy them faster. The threats are so powerful now that there isn't a delineation between Control plays these threats and Tempo plays these threats. It's all the same threats. It's Bowmaster, it's Murktide, it's Dauthi, it's Grief. It's they're not any different. The only difference is maybe you have some outliers in Urza Saga decks, in which case they're usually combo or some other form of go under you overpowered nonsense because Urza Saga is broken, or the Uro decks, in which case they're probably just in a second tier.
Yeah, I want to make one final note that I found that was kind of interesting, Phil, as I was playing on Moto the last couple of weeks. The number of times I put basically an Ophidian onto the board and then attacked with it once, and my opponent scooped immediately was pretty wild. Psychic Frog, not that impactful when it hits the board, but if it attacks once and trades a card up, people are just not willing to play that game with you.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain point where it's Psychic Frog's power of being a board control thing, if people haven't acclimated yet, if people aren't playing factual enough density of removal to be able to deal with Psychic Frog, then there's going to be positions where it's just going to control the board. Psychic Frog really leans to me that your days of Lightning Bolt are going to have to start to shift into more hard removal. Fatal Push gets a little bit of a nod. Fatal Push gets a little bit of a nod. The problem is that Fatal Push can't hit Murktide, and so Murktide is sort of, pressuring Fatal Push both ways.
And that's why we stopped playing Fatal Push for the longest time, because it was this is not going to do it.
Yeah, but the idea of okay, here's this 2-drop that more or less controls a board. And I actually heard on the Everyday Eternal podcast where they were relating Psychic Frog to Dreadhorde Arcanist in terms of how it can control a board. And the rationale behind it, from my understanding, was, okay, if you lay down your Psychic Frog, well, it can act as a way where your opponent can't attack into it and can't really block it effectively or for profit. In the similar way where it's if you had a Dreadhorde Arcanist and you went Lightning Bolt, attack you, flashback Lightning Bolt, control the board, or if there was a Lightning Bolt in the graveyard with a Dreadhorde Arcanist on board, then you were effectively locked against anything that would die to Lightning Bolt, right? You just have to play something and let it die, and then that snowballs, and that becomes really difficult to get through when games are not allowed to go that long. So in that regard, I can understand where if an opponent just scoops to an Ophidian single attack, because once you're at that point where you're down that card and it already implies so much it already implies so much card advantage in terms of how many cards are become irrelevant at that point. So if you've already gone up and you're already invalidating a suite of cards, that becomes just a game that's okay, well, this is inevitably going to end with me losing. It's just a matter of how much am I willing to endure it, right?
Okay, a final note. People should be playing more Run Afoul. That gets every creature in Delver Run Afoul. So anyhow, I think that's probably a good spot to stop it, Phil. We're gonna see. I'm gonna try and play a little bit this weekend. Play some Moto. this weekend, so you can tune in there. My Twitch channel thing is on the bottom there, so follow me or whatnot. And you've got something coming up, right? Monday.
Oh yeah, no, I just like I'm still
Every
testing,
Monday.
I just still test out brain. I'm like testing brain search. It's doing what it's doing, but like it still loses to all the same stuff that all of you other. There's nothing new to report on brain search. Like card
Fair
is
enough.
fine, card is good. You can never beat a Bowmasters, whatever.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. If you get a chance and you have the means, you can support us at patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thank you all for watching, and we will catch you next week. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.